My name is Mary Concentrated Collins, and I am 54 years old. I live alone. I have a daughter, a gray cat named Titus, and a habit of waking up at 6 a.m. without an alarm. That habit stayed with me forever, like a tattoo branded onto my subconscious. My neighbors on the floor know me as a quiet woman who always says hello, occasionally shares homemade jam, and never makes any noise. My ex-husband knew me as a boring provincial housewife who was lucky to have married such a brilliant man as him. None of them knew that 25 years of my life were dedicated to a service people do not speak about out loud. They didn't know I had gone through training that breaks most men by the third month. Or that I know how to do things that are better left undescribed. Or that my personal file is still kept in an archive under a classification badge that means "do not open" without special clearance. I left the service at 48 by my own choice. I was tired. I just wanted to live, grow tomatoes at a small cottage in upstate New York, read books, make jam, and see my daughter more than once every 6 months. By then, George had already been my ex-husband for 6 years, but that didn't stop him from continuing to mock me, now in conversations with Katie, during random encounters, at her birthday parties, and in the short, bitter comments he could slip into any conversation like a splinter. Dear viewers, please let us know where you are watching from and which region or country you are in. Please like this video, watch it until the end, and subscribe to our channel. Your support is very important to us. Thank you so much. We met when I was 26. I had already been in the service for 3 years by then, but no one in my civilian circle knew. My cover story was simple and foolproof. I worked as an analyst for a consulting firm. I traveled frequently on business. The salary was average. Nothing interesting. George worked for a construction company. He made good money, wore expensive watches, and knew how to tell jokes so well that everyone laughed. At a party hosted by mutual friends, he walked up to me with a glass of wine. "You are the quietest girl at this party," he said. "That is a rarity. Usually the quiet ones are the most interesting." He was wrong on both counts. I wasn't quiet by nature. I was quiet out of necessity. And the interesting parts were not at all what he expected. We dated for 8 months and then got married. I continued my service. My deployments were explained as business trips. The bruises that occasionally appeared were blamed on clumsiness. My closed-off nature was attributed to personality. George accepted every explanation. In fact, he wasn't particularly interested in what was going on inside me, neither in my mind nor in my soul. It suited him that I was quiet, that the house was always clean, that dinner was ready, and that I didn't throw tantrums or demand attention. 2 years later, Katie was born. That was when it all started. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, George began making small remarks. They were good-natured, or so he thought. "Mary, what were you thinking? This soup again? Don't you have any other recipes?" Then the jabs grew sharper. "Look, do you actually understand anything about finance? Let me handle it instead." Eventually, the gloves came off entirely. "You're just so plain, Mary. Just plain and boring. I don't know how they put up with you at work." I endured it not because I couldn't snap back. I could have answered in a way that would have kept him awake for a week. But there was Katie, and there was the cover story that could not be blown. There was the service which required me to remain invisible. So I stayed invisible. For 12 years, I played the part of plain, quiet Mary, the convenient target of his jokes. It was my job. It was just a different job than the one George saw. We divorced when Katie was 14. Not because I finally couldn't take it anymore. I could have endured another 12 years if necessary. George simply found another woman, 10 years younger, loud and vibrant. Everything he believed I was not. He left easily, almost cheerfully, as if dropping a boring weight from his shoulders. During the asset division in court, his lawyer spoke of our three-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn Heights with a condescending tone. The implication was that she won't understand the details anyway, so let's settle this amicably. I understood everything perfectly. I took the apartment, the car, and the cottage. George's lawyer spent a long time trying to figure out how that had happened. Katie stayed with me. George paid child support, took her for occasional weekends, and continued to drop stinging remarks about me whenever he got the chance. Your mother is a good woman, Katie, but she's just so plain. Mary has always been a bit out of touch with reality. You understand, Katie, your mom just doesn't really know how to navigate life. Katie heard it all, and Katie remembered it all. And one day, when she was 16 and found something among my things that I hadn't hidden well enough, she came to me and asked quietly, without hysterics, her face completely serious. Mom, who are you? I closed the bedroom door. We talked for 4 hours. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't have the right. But I told her enough. Enough for her to look at her father through different eyes. Enough for us to come up with a few signals in case something ever happened that couldn't be spoken about out loud. Dried flowers in a vase. 8 years passed. Katie grew up and married Dennis Wolfe, an architect from Hoboken. A decent man, as far as I could tell. They had an apartment in a new building, a ginger cat named Rusty, and plans for a suburban mortgage. I visited them once every 2 weeks, bringing jam and homemade cutlets. I would sit in their kitchen, drink tea, watch Katie laugh, and think to myself that everything was fine, that everything had turned out well. I had retired from the service, got my cat Titus, bought a new sofa, and signed up for Italian lessons because I had always wanted to learn but never had the time. By then, George and his vibrant woman had managed to divorce, remarry, and divorce again. He would occasionally call Katie or visit for holidays. He was still good at telling jokes, and he still routinely dropped passive-aggressive remarks about plain Mary. I didn't take offense, truly, I didn't, because I knew what he didn't. And then, that photograph arrived. At 11:47 p.m. on a Friday in November. The cab was already turning onto the street in Hoboken where my daughter lived when I felt it. It wasn't fear, no. It was something colder and sharper than fear. It was the exact sensation I had known since I was 23, and it had never lied to me. Something was very, very wrong. The driver slowed down near the turn, and I asked him to pull over about 150 yards early. An old habit. Never approach the target directly if you don't know what's waiting for you there. The November night in Hoboken smelled of wet asphalt and burning leaves. I walked along the building, staying close to the walls, scanning the windows. Katie and Dennis's apartment was on the 4th floor, a corner unit. The lights were on, which meant they were awake, or being kept awake. I stopped by a playground across from their entrance, watching one of the swings sway slightly, either from the wind or because someone had just stood up from it. People don't use swings at 11:59 p.m. I stood there for 3 minutes, observing. Nothing suspicious on the street. Cars parked neatly, empty inside. The entrance light was working normally. No unfamiliar silhouettes near the door. Then I went inside. I took the stairs, not the elevator. On the 3rd floor, it smelled of food. Someone was cooking late, frying meat. The 4th floor was silent. I stood outside Katie's door and listened. Voices. A man's voice, low, with a tense edge that I can hear beneath any intonation. And Katie's, steady. Too steady, the way it sounds when someone is trying with all their might to keep their composure. I rang the bell once. There was silence for about 3 seconds, an unnatural quiet, as if everyone inside had frozen. Then footsteps, and the door opened. Katie stood on the threshold in sweatpants and an old hoodie. Her hair was pulled back messily, and there was a dark shadow under her left eye. And it wasn't makeup. She saw me, and for a fraction of a second, her face flinched, not from fright, but from relief. An immense, almost childlike relief. "Mom," she said, "I didn't expect you so quickly." 12 minutes, I answered quietly. She stepped back, letting me in. I walked inside. The hallway smelled heavily of smoke. Dennis only smoked when he was extremely nervous. Katie had told me that before. 2 mugs sat on the entryway table, the tea inside barely touched. On the floor by the coat rack, I noticed his jacket, thrown down instead of hung on a hook. Another sign. When a person snaps, they stop noticing the little things. Dennis was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was 32, built solid, usually sample calm. I had seen him like that a few times and believed he knew how to keep it together. Right now, he was forcing it. His hands were clenched inside the pockets of his robe, his gaze uneasy, not angry, but hunted. "Mary," he said, "Katie shouldn't have bothered you." "Katie did the right thing," I replied, walking into the kitchen without asking for permission. We sat down. I brewed a fresh pot of tea. Both of their mugs were cold. I set the new cups in front of them and said, "Tell me what's going on, both of you, one at a time. Katie, you start." Katie looked at Dennis. He averted his eyes. She began. For the first 10 minutes, I listened and thought it was just a typical family story. Financial stress, the pressure of a mortgage, frayed nerves. It happens. People fight, say things they don't mean, and then make up. I sat there nodding, drinking my tea, trying to convince myself that this was all it was. A normal crisis, nothing more. But something felt off. I felt it with the same absolute certainty that I used to feel an ambush around the next corner when I was 23. Katie was talking about money. Something wasn't adding up in their joint account. Dennis had withdrawn a large sum without talking to her. He claimed it was for business needs, but she didn't understand what kind. Dennis interrupted her mid-sentence. "It's a work matter, Katie. I explained it to you." "You didn't explain anything," she said softly. "You just told me to trust you." I looked at Dennis. He wouldn't look at me. "How much?" I asked. A pause. $35,000, Katie said. Dennis looked up. "It's temporary. I'll put it back." "Where did you get it?" I asked. "From our joint savings," Katie answered for him. I nodded. $35,000. Significant, but not fatal, and certainly not pocket change. Still, it wasn't a reason to trigger a midnight panic signal. That meant it wasn't just about the money. I looked at Katie closely, knowing she could read my expressions. "What else?" I asked. She was quiet for a second, then said, "He hasn't slept in 3 nights. Today I found a note in his jacket. He doesn't know I found it." Dennis stood up abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "Katie, that has nothing to do with this." "Sit down," I said. Not harshly, just in the tone used by people who are accustomed to being obeyed. He sat down. I didn't ask about the note right away. I spent another half-hour listening to them explain the context. Dennis worked at an architectural firm, managing several projects. 3 weeks ago, a new partner appeared. A certain Ian Samuel Proctor. An older man with money and connections, he proposed a joint venture. Dennis was thrilled. It involved a massive residential complex upstate. Good money, great prospects. He invested his own money into the project, that same $35,000. He said it was like a buy-in, and that in 2 months he would see a 5-fold return. I listened in silence. In my head, things began clicking into place on their own, like a puzzle forming before you even realize you're assembling it. "Show me the contract," I told Dennis. "There is no contract," he answered after a slight delay. Ian works on trust. He doesn't like paperwork. Right then, something clicked inside me. That cold, precise feeling. I stood up, took my mug, placed it in the sink, then turned back to Dennis and asked calmly, "Do you know his full legal name, his registration details, or his business address? Did you look him up in the state business registry?" He looked at me the way people look when they are asked about something they completely failed to consider, with a faint bewilderment that quickly sharpens into dread. "He's a prominent man. People in the industry know him." "Who exactly knows him?" A long pause. "He told me so himself." I nodded. Katie was watching me. She realized I had understood the situation even before Dennis started answering, which was why she had sent the signal. Not because she was afraid of her husband, but because she was afraid for him. Smart girl. She always had been. I asked Katie to show me the note. Dennis flinched. "Wait, that's personal." But I had already reached out my hand, and Katie was already heading to the hallway toward his jacket. It was a piece of notebook paper, folded into quarters. Written on it by hand in ballpoint pen were just a few lines. I read it once, then again, and then laid the paper on the table. Dennis stared down at the tabletop. It was no ordinary business note. It was an address, street, building number, apartment, and a time. Saturday at 11 a.m. Below that was a sum, no longer $35,000 but $280,000, and a postscript at the bottom in a hurried script. "Or explain it to your wife yourself." I looked at the note for a few more seconds. Then I carefully folded it back into quarters, exactly the way it had been before, and placed it back on the table in front of Dennis. 280,000, I said. "This isn't a work matter." Dennis didn't answer. He stared at the paper as if trying to look away but unable to. "Do you already owe this Ian Proctor $280,000? I asked. Not aggressively, just clearly, leaving no room to maneuver. "I don't owe it," he said. "That's a different story." "Dennis." Katie spoke his name very quietly, barely a whisper. He looked up at her, and something inside him broke. I saw it physically, the way a person's shoulders suddenly drop, and all the tension they've been holding vanishes. "He says I owe him," Dennis muttered, "for bringing me into the project, for the connections, for introducing me to the right people. He calls it a commission." "A commission for what?" I asked. "For the opportunity to participate." I fell silent. Outside, a car drove past, casting a streak of light across the ceiling. Rusty the cat walked into the kitchen, rubbed against my leg, and walked back out. "So you paid $35,000 as a buy-in," I said slowly, "and now they are telling you that you owe an additional nearly $300,000 just for the right to make that investment." Dennis gave a single, short nod. Katie covered her face with her hands. She didn't cry. She just covered her eyes and then pulled them away. I stood up and walked to the window. Hoboken at midnight was quiet and indifferent. The lights were on in the building opposite us, where someone else was living their life, dealing with their own problems, having their own late-night kitchen talks. I looked at those lights and thought, the scheme was classic. So classic that it made me uneasy, not because of the complexity of the situation, but because of its absolute commonness. A man with money and connections lures a young specialist into a dream project. The initial buy-in acts as the hook, followed by a compounding debt justified by ever-evolving terms of participation, and the final leverage. Or explain it to your wife yourself. It wasn't business. It was extortion, laced with fraud. And Dennis, by all appearances, had been stewing in this alone for 3 weeks. "Why didn't you tell Katie right away?" I asked without turning around. A long pause. "Because it was my project, my idea, my choice. I thought I could handle it." "Handle it how? Find the money, pay it off, get out?" $280,000? I said. You were planning to find $280,000 in how much time? By Saturday at 11 a.m.? He went silent again. Saturday was the day after tomorrow. I turned around. Dennis sat at the table looking like a man who had finally stopped pretending he was in control. Katie lowered her hands, her eyes dry but her face pale. I need a name, I said. The full name. Ian Samuel is just a first and middle name. I need the last name and the phone number he writes from. Dennis pulled out his phone, opened the chat, and handed it to me. I read in silence. The exchange had been going on for 3 weeks. The early messages were professional, project details, plans, enthusiasm. Then the tone began to shift. First softly. Dennis, buddy, we need to discuss a quick point about the commission. Then, more insistently, you understand, I could have offered this to other people, but I respect you. And finally, the message from last night with the amount and the ultimatum. Or explain it to your wife yourself. The last name listed in the contacts was Proctor. Ian Samuel Proctor. I copied the phone number to my own phone, memorized the name, and handed the phone back to Dennis. Go to bed, I said. Katie looked at me. Mom, what are you going to do? Handle it, I replied. It's not urgent tonight. What is urgent is for both of you to get some sleep, especially you, Dennis. 3 nights without sleep isn't just nerves anymore. It's physiology. You're thinking worse than you normally can. He looked at me strangely, not offended, but surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to say exactly that. I'll stay on the couch, I added. Katie, do you have a blanket? She brought a blanket and a pillow. She and I stood in the hallway for another 5 minutes, speaking in hushed tones while Dennis went to wash up. Is it serious? Katie asked. Serious, I answered honestly. But not a catastrophe. Go on. Go to sleep. I hugged her quickly and firmly. We'll sort it out in the morning. I didn't sleep until almost 4 a.m. I lay on their couch under Katie's blanket, staring at the ceiling and thinking. Running through my head what I knew, what I didn't know, and what I needed to find out. Name, phone number, the address from the note, the suspected fraud scheme, the amount, $280,000. The timeline, Saturday, less than 48 hours. Dennis was cornered but not broken. Katie was holding up. In the morning, I got up at 6 a.m. as always. I put the kettle on, found eggs in their fridge, and made breakfast for the 3 of us. By 7 a.m., Katie woke up, and by 7:30, Dennis appeared with dark circles under his eyes, looking a bit more alive than the night before. Over breakfast, I told him, do not call or write anything to Ian today. If he writes to you himself, say that you are pulling the money together. Tell him you need until Monday. Until Monday? Until Monday, I confirmed. I need the weekend. He looked at me with the same expression as last night, surprised and a little bewildered. Then he nodded. I left for my place on Lexington Avenue at 9 a.m. Titus met me at the door with an air of offended dignity. His feeding was overdue by 9 hours. I poured him his food, brewed some coffee, sat down at the table, and opened my laptop. Ian Samuel Proctor. Check the state registry to see if there's a legal entity registered under that name. Run the phone number through databases to which I still maintained, let's call it unofficial access. The address from the note. Look up who owns it. By noon, I had enough to understand. Proctor was a real person. 61 years old. Registered address in Manhattan, near West End Avenue. 3 registered LLCs over the last 8 years. All 3 dissolved with outstanding debts. The phone number, however, was registered to a different name, a certain Victor Oliver Sterling, 35 years old. Interesting. I leaned back in my chair and topped off my coffee. 2 names, 1 phone number, 3 dead companies, and a scheme that looked less like the work of a lone operator and more like an established playbook run with a partner, division of roles, prearranged commissions, and personal leverage. I was just about to dial the number of someone I could call in such cases, a former colleague now working in an entirely different sector, but with the right connections, when my phone vibrated. The number was unfamiliar. I answered. Mary, a man's voice said. It was smooth, slightly baritone, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to never being refused. My name is Ian Proctor. We haven't met, but I heard you visited Dennis Wolf's family yesterday. I'd like to talk. I didn't say anything. I just waited. I understand it's unexpected, he continued, entirely unfazed by the silence. But Dennis is a good kid, and I wouldn't want his family affairs to get complicated because of our business matter. You understand? Business is business. Obligations must be met. What obligations exactly? I asked culturally. A brief pause. He hadn't expected the question. He expected either fear or aggression. Dennis knows, Proctor said. He's a grown man. He signed up for it himself. He didn't sign anything, I countered. There is no contract. I checked. This time, the pause was longer. Mary, I advise you not to meddle in affairs that don't concern you. This is a conversation between 2 business people, and it will be resolved. It is already being resolved, I said, and hung up. I put the phone on the table and looked at it. There it was. Proctor knew about me just a few hours after I had arrived at Katie's place. That meant either Dennis told him, which was highly unlikely, given how hunted he looked, or Proctor had someone watching who saw me enter the building, or, and I liked this option least of all, someone in Dennis's circle was feeding information to Proctor. I called Katie. Mom? Katie, answer one question for me. Who knew that you invited me over last night? A brief silence. No one. I didn't tell anyone. Wait. Another pause. Dennis called his dad last night. They talk sometimes, you know. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but Dennis mentioned your name. Something about you coming over to help sort things out. I closed my eyes for a second. George. George. I spoke the name to myself without anger, without surprise. I simply noted the fact, the way a thermometer notes a temperature. A fever. Not normal, but you know exactly where it came from. George had called Proctor. Or Proctor had somehow connected with George. Or, most interestingly, they already knew each other before this. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. Titus jumped onto the windowsill next to me, pressing his forehead against my hand. I scratched behind his ear automatically, without looking. One thing needed to be clear before moving forward. George, was it a random coincidence? Simple gossip? Or something else? He could have mentioned my name casually. Told his son-in-law's father that Mary was coming over to handle it. He could have. George was prone to saying too much without thinking about the consequences. It was in his character. He always viewed information as currency for social chatter rather than something to protect. But then where did Proctor get my phone number? That was the question that outweighed everything else. Katie hadn't given it to him. Dennis wouldn't have. He was too consumed by panic. Proctor had called me on a mobile number I had changed years ago. Katie had this number, a few friends had it, former colleagues had it, and, yes, George had it. Because Katie had given her father my new number just in case. I remembered that clearly. I called George just after 1 p.m. He answered on the third ring. His voice was bright, almost celebratory, as it always was on weekends. George loved Saturdays. Oh, Mary, he said with the exact intonation I knew by heart. a slight condescension wrapped in a facade of joy. Well, well, calling me yourself. What happened, old friend? I didn't beat around the bush. George, you spoke with Dennis yesterday and mentioned my name. Who else did you tell that I would be at their place? A brief pause, slightly longer than necessary for ordinary surprise. Wow, quite the questions first thing in the afternoon, he said, and I heard his tone shift into a different mode, a bit more cautious, a bit drier. I didn't tell anyone. I just gave Dennis a quick call to see how things were going. He said they had some nonsense going on with money and that you were coming over to help sort it out. But I was glad to hear you were helping. Glad, I repeated. Mary, why are you beating around the bush? Just say it straight. Straight then. A man named Ian Proctor called me on this exact number, less than 12 hours after I arrived at Katie's, and he had my number. This time the pause was longer, about 3 seconds. For George, that was an eternity. Well, I don't know, he finally said. I don't know any Proctor. Mary, you always overcomplicate things. You've been like that since we were young. Since we were young, I agreed calmly. George, if you know him, tell me now. It's important. This involves Katie. I tell you, I don't know any Proctor. He slightly raised his voice, and in that slight raise was something I had spent 25 years learning to detect. Not anger, not offense, something resembling an attempt to shut down a topic before it expanded. I said goodbye and hung up. Marked it in my mind. George is lying. I don't know why yet, but he's lying. For the next 2 hours I worked. Real work, the kind I know how to do, and that remains invisible from the outside. I ran the address from the note: Willow Avenue, Hoboken, Building 19, Apartment 42. The apartment was deeded to an individual, a certain Helen Valerie Sterling, 63 years old. Sterling, the same last name as Victor Oliver, the man registered to Proctor's phone number. Mother and son, presumably. Proctor was meeting Dennis at an apartment belonging to his partner's mother. Clever. Nothing was filed under his own name. I wrote this down on a piece of paper by hand, without a computer. Old habit. What is written by hand goes nowhere except the trash can. At 2:30 p.m., Katie called. Mom, Dennis just got a message from Proctor. Her voice was even, but behind the evenness, I could hear what she was holding back. He writes that he found out about you, and that if Dennis doesn't show up on Saturday alone without outsiders, he will make a phone call. What phone call? Did he specify? No, he just wrote, I will make one phone call, and your family will face a different kind of trouble. I fell silent. Rusty must have been rubbing against Katie's legs on the other end of the line. I heard her slight movement as she gently nudged him away. Katie, is there anything they could hold over you? Taxes? Registration? Something with the apartment documents? No, everything is clean. We went through the town clerk's office, everything by the book. Dennis, did he ever work under the table? Unofficial jobs? Off-the-books payments? A pause slightly longer than I would have liked. Mom, about 3 years ago, before we were married, he did a project, a private suburban house. The owner paid cash, no contract. Dennis said it was a one-time thing. Did he mention the amount? He didn't say exactly. I think maybe 25,000. There it was. A small hook left in the past. Something Dennis had probably stopped thinking about long ago. Proctor somehow knew about this job, or pretended to know, or was bluffing. The difference was significant, but I couldn't verify it right now. Fine, I said. Tell Dennis not to reply. I'll handle Saturday myself. Mom, what do you mean, handle it yourself? It means what it means, I answered softly. Do you trust me? A brief silence that felt warm. Yes, Katie said. I called Proctor myself at 4 p.m. from the same number he had reached me on that morning. He answered quickly. Mary, he said, almost cordially, as if we were old acquaintances. I'm glad you called back. Ian, I said. Let's meet. A slight pause. He hadn't expected this. He anticipated that I would pressure him, threaten him, or beg. A direct proposal to meet caught him slightly off guard. Meet? Just you and me? Without Dennis? Yes, just me. Tomorrow morning, if it suits you, I'll come to Hoboken. Silence. I could picture him thinking, calculating what this meant, looking for the trap. Fine, he finally said. Let's make it 11 a.m. I'll send the address. Send it. I agreed and hung up. The address arrived 7 minutes later. Willow Avenue, Building 19, Apartment 42. The exact address from the note in Dennis's jacket. He hadn't even bothered to think of a different place. I put the phone down and stared at the wall for a few seconds. Then I pulled out my paper with notes and added a single line at the bottom. Not to remember. I wouldn't forget anyway. Just to see it written down. George knows Proctor, because there was no other explanation. My phone number, the information about my visit to Katie, Proctor's reaction. Too fast, too precise for a random coincidence. And the fact that George lied to me today, not out of confusion or offense, but with the exact tone of a man slamming a door in your face. I thought about this for the rest of the day while preparing dinner, feeding Titus and packing a small bag for tomorrow. George, why would he do this? He always had enough money. He was back working in construction, as far as I knew from Katie, managing his own projects. This didn't look like Proctor's scheme. So what? Did he just feed my number to a common fraudster out of malice, out of that old habit of dropping something unpleasant at my feet? Or was he a part of it? Not just an acquaintance, but a participant. The thought was uncomfortable. I turned it over and over, trying to find where it clashed with the facts. But the facts raised no objections. At 8 p.m., Dennis called me himself, without Katie. Mary, he said, I wanted to tell you something I didn't mention last night. I waited. Ian Proctor. He mentioned George Sullivan, your ex-husband, once when we first met. He said they had crossed paths through work. I didn't think much of it. People cross paths all the time. There was silence in the receiver. Dennis was waiting for my reaction. I felt something inside grow even colder and more precise. Not anger, not offense, just clarity. The kind where the picture finally snaps together completely and you see it whole. And it's worse than when you only saw the pieces. Dennis, I said evenly, you did the right thing by calling. Go be with Katie. Tomorrow, I will deal with Proctor. But if you go there, isn't it dangerous? No, I answered simply. And it was the truth. I hung up, walked to the bathroom, opened the water heater panel, pulled out the item stored there, checked it, and put it back. There was no need to take it tomorrow, but knowing it was there was necessary. Then I went to bed. Titus curled up at my feet. Outside, a November rain fell, monotonous and indifferent. I thought about George, who for 20 years had laughed at Plain Mary, who dropped biting comments at Katie's birthday parties and explained to their daughter that her mother simply didn't know how to navigate life. The man who, by all accounts, had brought someone into his daughter's family to extract money through blackmail and threats. Intentionally or not, I intended to find out tomorrow. But of one thing I was already certain. On Saturday at 11 a.m. at Willow Avenue, Building 19, Apartment 42, Ian Proctor would not meet the woman he expected to see. I woke up at 6 a.m., as always. I was back on Lexington Avenue. Titus hadn't curled up at my feet this time, and it felt like a small breach in the usual routine. A minor thing, but a morning without him felt a bit colder than usual. I made coffee and checked my phone. Nothing from Katie, nothing from Dennis. That meant the night had passed quietly. Nothing from Proctor either. He was waiting for Saturday, confident in his position. I drank my coffee, standing by the window. Lexington Avenue was waking up slowly. A city bus passed without stopping. A sanitation worker in an orange vest scraped the wet asphalt. In the building opposite, a light turned on in a third-floor window. A typical Saturday morning. Except this Saturday was anything but typical. At 7:30 a.m., Katie called me. Her voice was even, but behind the evenness, I could hear what she herself probably couldn't. A thread of tension pulled tight as a wire. It happens when a person hasn't really slept all night, but only pretended to. Mom, Dennis got another message last night at 3 a.m. What did it say? Proctor writes that he has information about you, personally about you, and that if you show up today, he will use it. I set my mug on the windowsill. Did he specify what kind of information? No, just, I know who your mother-in-law really was, and it makes for an interesting conversation for certain people. I stood and looked at the street. The worker reached the corner and turned back. A bus passed again, this time with passengers behind fogged windows. There it was. I thought about it for about 20 seconds. That was exactly how long it took me to realize it was a bluff. If Proctor had real information about me, about who I actually was, about my service, about my classified file, he would have used it differently, not as a 3 a.m. text threat. It was an attempt to scare me before the meeting, to make me show up already broken, or not show up at all. A classic tactic: pressure the relatives, strike the perimeter when the center holds. But he knew enough from somewhere to drop hints. This meant one thing: George had shared more than just a name. Katie, I said, tell Dennis not to reply. I'm on my way. Mom, if he really has something on you... He doesn't, I interrupted calmly. Go have some tea. I'll be there around 10. I put the phone down, then picked it up again and dialed a number I hadn't called in 8 months. Long rings. I waited. 7, 8, 9. Hello? A voice answered, raspy, sleepy. He had been woken up. Brian, I said. It's Mary Collins. Sorry for the early call. A pause. Then in a different voice, completely awake. Mary? How many years has it been? What happened? Brian Andrew Kelly. We had served together for 15 years. He had left before me, at 43, for health reasons. Now he worked in consulting, whatever that meant in his case. He lived in Hoboken. Occasionally, once every year or two, he would send me a short message. How are you? I would reply, fine. He would reply, I'm fine too. And that would be the end of the exchange. He lived in Hoboken. I had remembered that last night while I couldn't sleep. I need help, I said. Nothing physical today, just presence and eyes. Another pause, then, send the address. What time? At 10:45 a.m., Willow Avenue, Building 19. Stand near the entrance, don't go inside. Got it, he said. No unnecessary questions. That was what I had always valued in him. I packed my bag, checking a few items I brought not for threats, but for documentation. A small voice recorder that looked like a regular keychain, and a phone with the recording turned on. I dressed neither elegantly nor poorly, just neatly. Dark trousers, a gray sweater, a coat. The same plain Mary everyone was used to seeing. Let him expect exactly that. I took a cab to Hoboken, asking the driver to stop a block away from Willow Avenue. I got out and walked. At 10:42 a.m., I saw Brian near the entrance of Building 19. He was standing there, looking at his phone. He looked exactly like a man waiting for someone. Nothing remarkable. We didn't greet each other. I simply walked past, and he gave a barely perceptible nod. The entrance, the fourth floor, stairs, not the elevator. On the third floor, it smelled exactly like the hallway in Katie's building, except they were frying onions instead of meat. Strange how similar the stairwells in these new Hoboken buildings were. Apartment 42. I rang the bell. It wasn't Proctor who opened the door. It was a young man, about 35, tall, with the indifferent face of someone who had opened doors to strangers many times and had long stopped being surprised by it. Victor, I thought. Victor Oliver Sterling. The phone was registered to him. The apartment belonged to his mother. Mary? He asked. Yes. Come in. The apartment was furnished without character. Showroom furniture from a shopping center. Nothing personal on the walls. Two office chairs sat near a coffee table. It looked as though they received clients here rather than guests, which was exactly the case. I understood. This was a working apartment, not a home. Proctor was sitting in one of the chairs. 61 years old, thick-set, with a neat gray beard, he looked exactly like a prominent man with money and connections should look. A well-fitting jacket, hands resting calmly on the armrests. He knew how to project an impression. I noted that immediately. He knew how to sit in a way that made the other person feel an urge to justify themselves. Mary, he said, please, take a seat. I sat down. Victor remained standing by the wall, slightly behind and to my side. A standard tactical arrangement. I pretended not to notice. I'm glad we met, I said. Proctor slightly raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected such an opening. I want to say right away, I continued evenly, this conversation is being recorded with your knowledge. Now you know. Behind me, Victor shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Proctor's face didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly on the armrests. An interesting woman, he remarked. George Sullivan said you were unexpected. George Sullivan said many things, I agreed. Have you known each other long? Long enough, 3 or 4 years. He paused. But what difference does that make? It makes a difference, I said calmly. If you've known each other for less than 2 years, George couldn't have known my new phone number, and if it's longer than he met you before Dennis even started working at his firm, that changes the picture. Proctor stared at me. Something appeared in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Not respect yet, but something akin to recalculation. He was reassessing who he was dealing with. Mary, he said, slightly slower than before. Let's talk about practical matters. Your son-in-law took on an obligation. That obligation must be met. 280,000 is not the kind of sum worth ruining a young family's life over. There is no obligation, I replied. There is no contract, no receipt, nothing that could be presented in court. Court is a long and unpleasant process for everyone, he murmured softly. I'm not talking about court. I'm talking about the fact that everyone has a history. Dennis has one, and I hear you do too. There it was. I had been waiting for this. Tell me about my history, I said. I'm curious to hear. Proctor smiled. Not maliciously, but rather professionally, the smile of a man accustomed to this turning point in a conversation. George Sullivan mentioned that you spent many years working within agencies, serious agencies, and that your departure wasn't entirely voluntary. I looked at him and kept silent. Not out of confusion, I was simply giving him time to finish. Such things are sometimes interesting to certain people, he added. Which people exactly? I asked. Various people. I nodded, then stood up slowly without rushing and walked to the window. Outside was a courtyard, a swing set, a bench where an elderly woman sat with a dog. A typical Hoboken courtyard on a Saturday. November, but without snow, just gray and damp. Proctor didn't tell me to sit back down. Behind me, Victor leaned slightly forward. "Ian," I said without turning around, "what George Sullivan told you about my work is not true. It is a lie. Or rather, it's not the whole truth." I turned around. My departure was voluntary. That is easily verified. But more importantly, the people I served with have a habit of keeping an eye on what happens to their former colleagues, especially when outsiders display a sudden interest in their biographies. A pause. "Is that a threat?" Proctor asked. His voice grew drier. "No," I replied. "It is simply information. Just like the following. I checked your 3 LLCs. All three were dissolved with outstanding debts to contractors. The total sum is around $900,000. That isn't fraud in itself. Dissolutions with debt happen for various reasons. But combined with the scheme you applied to Dennis, and the fact that the phone you used to message him is registered to Victor Sterling rather than you, it presents an interesting picture for an investigator." Victor froze by the wall. "Are you gathering material?" Proctor said. It was a statement, not a question. "I have already gathered it," I replied. That was part of the truth. I had enough material for a report, but not enough for a guaranteed outcome. The legal system is slow. Proctor's scheme was refined, and he knew that as well as I did. Pressuring him with purely legal arguments wasn't enough, but he didn't know that yet. I walked back to the chair but didn't sit down. I stood beside it, looking down at him, which altered the geometry of the conversation. "Ian, I have a proposal," I said. "Dennis returns the $35,000, the exact amount he actually received. No interest, no commissions. You sign a release stating you have no claims against him, and we go our separate ways." Proctor looked at me for a long time, then spoke. "And if not?" "Then I hand over the material." "Where?" "To several places simultaneously," I answered calmly. "Part of it through official channels, part through unofficial ones. I have 25 years of connections, Ian. I am a quiet woman, as George Sullivan told you, but quiet women sometimes know a lot of people." The silence in the room grew thick. Victor looked at Proctor. Proctor looked at me. And right there, in that silence that dragged on for about 20 seconds, something inside me suddenly faltered. Not on the outside. On the outside, I stood firm, my face calm, my voice under control. But inside, in the place that usually remained silent for years, something struck hard and painfully. George, not Proctor. Proctor was predictable. This was business. This could be resolved. But George, the man I had lived with for 12 years, Katie's father, who knew his daughter had a young family, a mortgage, a cat named Rusty, and plans for the future. And he still did it. Why? Out of an old habit of devaluing me? Out of some petty revenge because I kept the apartment and the car? He had handed my number to this man, related stories about my service while twisting the facts to fit their leverage, and helped orchestrate the pressure on his own son-in-law. I stood in the middle of a stranger's working apartment in Hoboken and felt something I hadn't felt in probably 10 years. Tiredness. Not physical. Physically, I was fine. A deep, bone-weary tiredness that this man, even after 20 years, still found ways to enter my life and ruin something in it. Proctor was saying something. I heard his voice, but for a second or two, I didn't register the words. I was stuck inside that tiredness. Then I poured myself together, snapping back into operational mode like shifting gears. "Repeat that," I said evenly. Proctor looked at me a bit differently than before, as if he had seen something he hadn't planned on seeing. I said, "I need time to think." "Until Monday," I replied. "I expect an answer by Monday at noon. If there is no answer, I start moving." I took my bag and walked to the door. At the threshold, I stopped and turned, not toward Proctor, but toward Victor. Victor, I said quietly. The apartment is deeded to your mother, Helen Sterling. Does she know what it's being used for? Victor didn't answer, but something in his face shifted. I left. Brian was standing by the entrance looking at his phone. I walked past. He fell into step beside me, and we walked toward the street. Two ordinary people on a Saturday morning. All good? He asked quietly. All good, I replied. How are things with you? I thought for a second. I'm tired, I said honestly. For the first time in a long time. Honestly, not for a report, not for a cover story. Brian nodded. We reached the corner and he stopped. Mary, he said, I dug into Proctor last night. You were right about the scheme. This isn't his first time. I found 3 similar cases over the last 2 years. They were all swept under the rug. The victims paid because they didn't want the exposure. But one of them didn't pay. I looked at him. Who? A guy from Yonkers. A certain Arthur Vance Nelson. A builder. Like Dennis. Proctor hit him for $500,000. Nelson refused to pay and went to the police. The case was closed a month later. Insufficient evidence. But Nelson kept his money. Can you connect me with him? Already did, Brian said. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it over. Here's his number. I called him this morning while you were up there. Told him there was someone this could help. He agreed to talk. I took the paper and looked at it. A phone number, a name, and at the bottom, a note in Brian's handwriting. He says he has something that didn't make it into the police file. Something shifted inside me. Not tiredness, no. Something else. That cold, precise feeling I had known since I was 23. Only now it wasn't directed outward. It turned inward on the situation, like a scope finding its target. Proctor thought he had frightened me with a threat about my service. George thought he had helped him. Both were wrong, because they saw a plain, quiet Mary standing in the middle of a stranger's apartment, thinking she might have faltered for a second. But I hadn't faltered. I simply realized that Proctor alone wasn't enough, that I needed to go deeper, back to where this whole story began, to the man who for 20 years thought he was smarter than me. Brian, I said, slipping the paper into my pocket. Thank you. I owe you one. You don't owe me anything, he replied simply. Call Nelson today. Before evening. He's expecting it. We parted at the corner. I walked toward the bus stop, and the November air smelled of wet asphalt and burning leaves. Exactly the same as the night I had stepped out of the cab and walked toward Katie's building. Only then I was going to save my daughter from someone else's trouble. Now I was going to do something else. Arthur Vance Nelson answered on the second ring. His voice sounded weary, not from lack of sleep, but from something deeper. That is how people sound when they have carried something heavy for a long time and have almost grown accustomed to the weight. Brian Kelly warned me you would call, he said without preamble. Yes, I replied. He mentioned you have something that didn't make it into the police file. A short pause. I could hear him closing a door. Moving away, probably, to speak without unintended ears listening. I do, Nelson said. But first tell me, is it the same scheme out there? The buy-in fee, then the mounting debt, then the personal leverage? Exactly, I replied. And did they mention anyone from your circle? Someone who, according to them, had crossed paths with them before? I stopped right on the sidewalk. A woman with a stroller walked past, glancing at me. Yes, I said slowly. They mentioned someone. That is exactly what isn't in the file, Nelson said. They have an inside man. Not an outsider, an insider. Someone who provides them with information about the victim beforehand, about their weak spots, their finances, their family. Proctor doesn't look for victims himself. They are brought to him. I stood on the sidewalk in Hoboken on a gray November afternoon, listening to this, and felt something inside slowly begin to crack, like ice beneath my feet. "Did someone recommend this Proctor to you?" I asked. "An old acquaintance," Nelson answered. "We weren't close, but we crossed paths through work. Construction isn't that large an industry. Everyone knows everyone. He mentioned there was an interesting guy with projects, a chance to make good money. I went along with it. The rest was standard." "What was his name? This acquaintance?" A long pause, about 4 seconds. "George Patrick Sullivan." My breath caught. Not from surprise. I already knew the answer. I had felt it even as I walked to the bus stop. But it is one thing to know it inside, and another to hear it out loud from a stranger you are speaking to for the first time in your life, someone who knows nothing about you, or Katie, or the 12 years of marriage. Sullivan. George changed his last name after his second divorce, taking his mother's maiden name. I remembered Katie mentioning it in passing without details. George Patrick Sullivan, my ex-husband, the father of my daughter. He hadn't just accidentally mentioned my name in a conversation with his son-in-law. He was bringing people to Proctor intentionally, systematically. He was part of the scheme. I didn't cry. I rarely cry anyway. That had been beaten out of me at 23 during the 3rd month of training. But what I felt standing on that sidewalk was worse than tears. It was something blunt and heavy, like a blow to the ribs without a wind-up. Not a sharp pain, but a dull, lingering ache. 20 years. For 20 years he had said I was plain, that I didn't know how to navigate life, that I was lucky to marry a man like him. And all this time, what had he been doing? Leading people to a fraudster for money? For pleasure? Or simply because he needed the feeling that he was smarter, that he was controlling the situation? "Mary?" Nelson called out to me. "Yes," I answered. "I'm here. Continue." "This Sullivan, is he an acquaintance of yours?" "My ex-husband," I said evenly. Silence on the other end. Nelson didn't know what to say to that. I understood him. "I'm sorry," he finally murmured. "Don't be," I replied. "Arthur, what you just told me, are you willing to state it officially?" "If it helps pin Proctor down, yes," he said without hesitation. "I tried once before. I couldn't do it alone. Maybe together we can." I took down his contact information, said goodbye, and put the phone in my pocket. Then I just stood there for another 3 minutes, looking at the gray sky over the Hoboken rooftops, breathing. There it was. Rock bottom. I had found it. Not in Proctor's apartment, nor in the night I arrived at Katie's. Here, on the sidewalk, in a conversation with a man from Yonkers who uttered the name I already knew, but still hadn't wanted to hear. George wasn't just leaking my number, he was participating, earning or receiving something else that he valued more than money. Perhaps simply the sensation of power over those he considered below him, or perhaps the money too. That remained to be seen. I walked to the bus stop slower than usual. November pressed down on my shoulders with its damp air, it squelched underfoot. And I thought about how I had lived next to a man for 12 years and hadn't known the core of him. Or I had known it, but convinced myself it was just his personality, just a weakness, just a habit of saying too much. I hadn't allowed myself to think it could be something else. Perhaps that was my mistake. The only one over these years, but a significant one. The bus was warm and smelled of wet clothes. I sat by the window, looking at the Hoboken streets, no longer thinking about George, but about what to do next. Proctor was waiting for an answer by Monday. I had Nelson's statement. I had the background on the 3 dissolved LLCs. I had the recording of today's conversation. Proctor had said enough to qualify it as a threat, even if wrapped in polite words. There was the information about the phone registered to Victor Sterling. There was the apartment belonging to his mother. But all of this wasn't enough for what I wanted. The police take a long time. Cases of this type fall apart because fraudsters know how to walk the line. Nothing signed. Word against word. We are just business partners with disagreements. Nelson had already gone through that and lost. I needed something else. Something Proctor hadn't anticipated, and something George wouldn't be able to explain. The bus stopped near a transit center on the way back into the city. Some passengers got off. I remained seated and kept thinking. Victor. He was the weak link. Not Proctor. Proctor was experienced, hardened. He had emerged from similar situations before without consequences. But Victor was 35. The phone was in his name. His mother's apartment was being used as the base of operations. And my final remark at the door. Does she know what it's being used for? Something in his face had changed. I had seen it. Victor had something to lose, and he knew I understood that. I pulled out my phone and texted Brian. Can you find the personal number for Victor Oliver Sterling? Not the one registered for work. His personal one. The reply came 18 minutes later. A number and a short note. Be careful. I looked at the number and thought, call today or wait. Wait. Give him time to process the morning conversation. Let the fear grow. Or call now, catch him in the moment while it's still fresh. The bus was entering Manhattan. A fine rain began to fall outside. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with a measured squeak. I called now. Victor answered after 5 rings. A long time, meaning he deliberated whether to pick up. Hello, he said. His voice was flat, neither welcoming nor hostile. Victor, I said. It's Mary Collins. We saw each other this morning. A pause. Then, where did you get this number? It doesn't matter, I replied calmly. I am calling you, not Ian Proctor. That should tell you something. Silence. He was thinking. What do you want? He finally asked. To talk separately, without Proctor. A long pause. I could hear his breathing, slightly accelerated. What is there for us to talk about? About your mother, Victor. About her apartment on Willow Avenue, and whether she knows what happens there every Saturday. The silence grew thick, so much so that I could almost physically feel it. I'll call you back, he said. His voice cracked slightly. I'll wait until 8 p.m., I replied and hung up. The bus pulled up to the subway station. I got out and stood under the awning. The rain intensified. Nearby, a young guy was eating a wrap, sauce dripping onto his jacket. He didn't notice. A typical New York Saturday. I called Katie. She picked up immediately. She had been waiting. Mom, how did it go? Fine, I said. Katie, I need to ask you something about your dad. Be honest. A pause. Short, but palpable. Ask. Did he ever ask you to tell him about Dennis's affairs, his work, his money, his partners? Katie was silent for about 3 seconds, then said softly, he asked sometimes. I thought he was just interested. As a father. Frequently? In the last year, yes. More than before. I closed my eyes for a second. That was where Proctor learned about Dennis's unofficial job from 3 years ago. Katie had told her father without any malice, just in conversation. And George had passed it along. Everything aligned. Mom, Katie said, does Dad have something to do with this? I thought about how to answer, honestly or cautiously. I chose honesty. Yes, I said. It looks like he does, but don't say anything to him yet, and tell Dennis the same thing. A long silence. Mom. Her voice changed, losing its fear, becoming that serious adult voice I had first heard when she was 16 and asked, who are you? Will you stop him? Yes, I answered simply. I put the phone away. Rain beat against the awning overhead. The guy with the wrap left. People emerged from the subway, walking past, each with their own Saturday. By 8 p.m., Victor Sterling would call me himself. I was almost certain of it, because he had a mother with an apartment on Willow Avenue, and that mattered more than any loyalty to Proctor. And when he called, I would have what I was missing. Not for the police, for something more precise and faster. George, Proctor, Victor. 3 points on a map I had just begun to draw. Plain, quiet, Mary stood under the awning of a New York subway station and drew that map in her head. Methodically, without anger, without haste. Anger is a poor tool. I had known that since I was 23. Precision is a different matter. Victor called at 7:43 p.m., earlier than I expected. "Mary," he said. His voice was different, not the indifferent tone from this morning at the door. Quieter, with the intonation people have when they've made a decision and don't yet know if it's the right one. "I am ready to talk, but not over the phone." "Where?" I asked. "There is a diner on the Palisades Parkway, the Birchwood. Do you know it?" "I'll find it." "What time?" "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. "Fine," I agreed, adding before he could hang up. "Victor, does your mother know?" A long pause. "No," he muttered hollowly. "I thought as much," I said softly, not maliciously, just stating a fact. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. I put the phone away and sat at my table on Lexington Avenue for some time, looking at Titus, who had settled on the windowsill and was looking back at me with an air of philosophical indifference. Outside was a Sunday New York, quiet, gray, with sparse streetlights. I needed the help of one more person. Not for the meeting with Victor, I was going there alone, but for the other part, the part that couldn't be done solo. I dialed the number for Allison Constance Fox. We had met 7 years ago. She was working as an investigator in a New York police precinct back then. Now she had gone into private practice, handling civil cases. Smart, cautious, the kind of person who doesn't take on hopeless cases, but if she does, she sees them through to the end. "Mary," she answered on the second ring. "Haven't heard from you in a while. What's happened?" I briefly laid out the situation. About 7 minutes without extraneous details, just the facts, the scheme, the amounts, the 3 dissolved LLCs, Nelson's testimony, the audio recording from today's meeting, the phone in someone else's name. And George, his role, his name changed to Sullivan, the construction sector, the information on the victims. Allison listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for about 3 seconds. "Do you have the recording of today's conversation?" "Yes." Proctor said enough. "Good. Nelson's testimony. Is he ready to file it officially?" "Yes." He said so himself. "Then here is the thing," Allison said. "On Monday, you wait for Proctor's answer. If he rejects your proposal, and he most likely will, people like that rarely back down the first time, you will have grounds for a complaint. The recording plus Nelson's testimony plus the LLC files, that is no longer word against word. That is something." "How much is something?" I asked directly. "A chance," she answered honestly. "Not a guarantee, but a real chance, especially if Sterling talks tomorrow." "What about George?" A brief silence. "George is a separate story. If he systematically supplied information about victims and received something for it, a fee, a cut, whatever, that is complicity in fraud. But it needs to be proven. Nelson can identify him as the person who introduced him to Proctor. That is already something." "Are there other victims?" Brian spoke of 3 similar cases. One I know, Nelson. The other 2 I haven't found. "Find them," Allison said. "That is the priority for tomorrow. If 2 or more people say the same thing about Sullivan, it's no longer a coincidence. I wrote it down. We said goodbye. She promised to be ready for Monday. I thanked her. We both knew that thank you in these circles meant the bill would arrive later. And that was standard. On Sunday morning, the Birchwood Diner on the Palisades Parkway turned out to be small, with wooden booths and the scent of fresh pastries. Victor sat by the window, holding a mug of coffee with both hands as if warming himself. As I appeared, he looked up. There was no hostility in his eyes. There was tiredness, similar to what I had heard from Nelson over the phone. The tiredness of a man who had carried something for too much time. I ordered tea, sat opposite him, and didn't rush him. Sometimes you have to let a person begin on their own. He began a minute later. Mom doesn't know, he said. I told her I was renting the apartment as an office for client meetings. She was happy. Extra money? She's retired. She needs the help. I pay her rent. A fair amount. How long has this been going on? I asked. 2 years. He looked into his mug. I met Ian Proctor through mutual acquaintances. He proposed a joint venture. I thought it was normal consulting work, helping to find the right people, connecting them with investors. I didn't realize at first how exactly it worked. And then you realized, I said. Then I realized. He looked up. But by that point, I was already inside. My phone, my mother's apartment. He used it as insurance. That if I backed out, he would tell my mom, show her what the apartment was actually being used for. I looked at him. 35 years old, built solid, seemingly calm, and caught in the exact same trap as his victims. Proctor knew how to do this. First involve them, then compromise them, then hold them. Victor, are you ready to give a statement about exactly how the scheme works from the inside? He fell silent for a long time, nearly a minute. I didn't push. What do I get out of it? He finally asked. Not arrogantly, just honestly, the way a man asks when he wants to know the price. I am not a prosecutor, I answered. I cannot guarantee you anything official, but if you cooperate, it is taken into account. Always taken into account. And your mother will not hear anything unnecessary from me. He nodded slowly, as if agreeing to something he had known for a long time. There is something else, he murmured. Ian keeps records. Not on a computer, in a notebook. Names, amounts, dates. He's old-fashioned that way. That notebook is kept at his house. I didn't show that this was vital. I simply asked calmly, "Do you know the address?" "Near West End Avenue," Victor said. "Building an apartment?" "Yes, I've been there. West End Avenue." That was exactly Proctor's registered address. I remembered it from what I found on the first day. Everything aligned. I didn't tell Victor what exactly I would do with this information. I simply thanked him, paid for my tea, and stood up. "Mary," he said as I was putting on my coat, "this Sullivan guy who brings people in, does he know you figured him out?" "Not yet," I replied. "He's dangerous." I thought for a second. George. Was he dangerous? Not physically. No, he never had been. But in a different way. The way people can be dangerous when they believe they are smarter than everyone else around them and exploit that conviction systematically, without remorse. In his own way, I answered honestly. From the diner, I called Brian and told him about the notebook. "A notebook is good," he said immediately, "but don't touch it yourself. It has to be done correctly. Otherwise, the evidence becomes inadmissible." "I know," I said. "There is a way to do it officially." A pause. Brian was thinking. "If there is a formal complaint, an investigator can initiate a search warrant, but that takes time. You only have until Monday." "Which means we need to expedite it," I said. "Mary, do you have the recording of the conversation with Proctor?" "Yes." "And Nelson's statement?" "We agreed on filing it." "Then here is the thing," Brian said. "I know someone in the Hoboken Detective Bureau. We served together briefly, but enough. He isn't the type to drag his feet. If I ask him to look at the material today, he'll look at it. Today is Sunday, I pointed out. I know, Brian answered, and in his voice was that same laconic reliability I remembered from the days when we worked together. That doesn't mean he won't answer. The detective from the bureau was named Max Dominic O'Connor. Brian sent his number at 1 p.m., and I called immediately. O'Connor answered, listened, and asked to have the recording and the LLC files forwarded. I forwarded them through Brian. It was more appropriate that way. At 3 p.m., O'Connor called back himself. The recording is interesting, he said dryly. There is a thread in it, albeit wrapped up, given the company profiles. And if Nelson gives a statement, we can move. I need an official complaint from your son-in-law with his signature, and from Nelson too. When? Tomorrow morning before 11 a.m. If you make it, I have grounds to act before your deadline with Proctor. I called Dennis, explained briefly, without extra details. He listened in silence, and I heard in that silence something that hadn't been there on Friday night or Saturday morning, something firm that appears in a person when they stop carrying everything alone and realize someone is standing beside them. I'm ready, he said. Where do I go? I gave him the address, the time, and O'Connor's name. Then I dialed Nelson. He answered immediately and agreed without hesitation. High time, he uttered briefly. There remained George. I thought about it all Sunday evening while cooking oatmeal, feeding Titus, and looking out the window at the dark street. With Proctor, it was clear. The scheme, the complaint, the investigation. Victor as an inside witness, the notebook as physical evidence. That was work for O'Connor and Allison. Slow, but real. George was different. He hadn't been present at the meetings with the victims. He didn't take money directly, at least, it wasn't visible how. He simply introduced people, supplied information, named names. And yet for 20 years, he had been confident that plain, quiet Mary would never put two and two together. I decided I would speak with him myself. Not through a lawyer, not through an investigator. Myself. Because this wasn't just a legal matter. This was a matter between the two of us, and he needs to finally understand that. I wrote him a message on Monday morning at 8:30 a.m. George, we need to meet today. It's important. Not for me, for you. The reply arrived 20 minutes later. What's with the riddles first thing in the morning, Mary? Fine. 1 p.m. I have an office on Madison Avenue. Fine, I replied. At 10 a.m., Dennis and Nelson were at O'Connor's office. I knew this because Dennis texted briefly, signed. O'Connor says he's starting to work. Allison had read the complaint even earlier and texted me. Strong. Especially in tandem with the recording. At 10:30 a.m., Proctor sent a message to my phone. Mary, I've thought it over. Your proposal is unacceptable. We expect Dennis on Saturday. He didn't know that Saturday no longer mattered, that by this time the investigator had the complaint, the recording, and enough material to initiate an inquiry, that Victor had agreed to testify, and that Nelson had finally found an ally. I didn't reply to Proctor. I simply forwarded his message to O'Connor and Allison. At 1 p.m., I walked into George's office on Madison Avenue. He was sitting behind a large desk in a fine chair, looking like a man who had everything under control. An expensive watch, a crisp shirt, a slight smile. The exact same one he had walked up to me with at the party all those years ago with a glass of wine. Mary, he said, sit down. What's broken? I sat down, placing my phone on the desk face down. George, I said. He winced slightly. He didn't like me using his formal name. Do you know Ian Proctor? A statement, not a question. He didn't answer right away, smiling a bit forcedly. Back to your old ways, Mary. I already told you. You brought Nelson to him. Arthur Vance Nelson from Yonkers. I continued evenly. 2 years ago, just as you brought Dennis to him. Most likely. Not just the two of them. The smile faded from his face, slowly, like ice melting, not all at once, but inevitably. I don't know what you're talking about, he uttered. His voice became different, the exact one I had heard on the phone on Saturday when he was shutting the door on the topic. You know? I said calmly. Nelson named you this morning, to an investigator, officially. George didn't move, but something in him changed. I could see it by his hands. His fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of his chair. To an investigator, he repeated quietly. Yes, and Dennis filed a complaint too. Today. A long, thick silence followed, one that contained an immense amount of weight. Mary, he finally said, without the condescending tone. Just Mary. Do you realize what you are doing? I realize, I replied. This concerns Katie too. This is her father. Do you want her to? George. I spoke his name just as I had told Dennis to sit down on Friday night. Without anger. Just precisely. Katie knows. I told her. Not everything, but enough. He looked at me. And in that gaze, for the first time in 20 years, there was no condescension. There was none of that light mockery with which he had always looked at plain, quiet Mary. There was something else. Something I couldn't name with a single word, but which I recognized immediately. It was understanding. Belated, uncomfortable, painful, but understanding that he had made a mistake not just now, but long ago. That all this time he had looked at a woman and hadn't seen her at all. You were always different, he murmured quietly, not with admiration, just stating the bare fact that had finally surfaced. I just didn't want to see it. I stood up, taking the phone from the desk. You have until evening, I said. If you approach the investigator yourself and give a statement on exactly how your scheme with Proctor worked, it will be taken into account. Allison Constance Fox. Write down the name. She knows the case. He looked up at me from below, for the first time in all the years I had known him. And if I don't? Then the investigation will come to you itself, I replied. It will just take a bit longer, but it will come. I put on my coat and walked to the door. Mary, he called out behind me. I stopped but didn't turn around. I didn't think it would go this far with Dennis. I thought I'd just introduce them, and they'd figure it out. I stood with my back to him, thinking that he was telling the truth. That was exactly how it was. He didn't think. He never thought about the consequences for others. He was accustomed to assuming that the plain and quiet people around him existed merely as background noise, that his decisions didn't truly reach them. Now you are thinking, I said, and walked out. It was cold outside. Madison Avenue hummed with cars, buses, someone honking in traffic. A typical New York Monday. I walked toward the subway, thinking that I had done everything I could do alone. From here on, it was up to O'Connor, Allison, the investigation, time. The phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. I answered. Mary, a man's voice said. Not Proctor, not Victor. Another one, unfamiliar, official. This is Detective Max O'Connor. We have new developments. You need to come in. I took a cab to O'Connor's office. The subway would have been faster, but I needed those 20 minutes in the car to think. Outside the window, a gray and indifferent New York flashed past, and I watched it, playing a single phrase over in my mind. New developments. O'Connor hadn't explained over the phone. That could mean many things. Good or bad, unexpected or logical. Detectives don't say new developments for no reason. When I entered the precinct building on Clinton Street in Hoboken where O'Connor worked, the first person I saw in the hallway was Victor Sterling. He was sitting on a chair against the wall, staring at the floor, hands folded on his knees. At my appearance, he looked up, and his face held the expression of someone who had done something irreversible and didn't yet know if it had been right. He came in on his own, O'Connor said when I stepped into his office. Small, with institutional furniture, stacks of folders on the windowsill, the scent of instant coffee. Max O'Connor turned out to be around 45, lean, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen a lot and had long ceased to be surprised. Sterling came in at 9 a.m. before Dennis and Nelson. I didn't expect it. He brought evidence. O'Connor placed a phone inside a clear plastic evidence bag on the desk before me. This is Proctor's working phone. Victor took it on Friday after your visit. Says he grabbed it off the table in the apartment on Willow Avenue while Proctor was out of the room. There is 18 months of correspondence on it. I looked at the bag. A phone in clear plastic. Small, black, ordinary. And inside it, by all accounts, was everything Proctor had never planned to show anyone. And what's in the messages? Names, O'Connor said briefly. 9 names, 9 people over 18 months. And among the contacts is George Patrick Sullivan, marked as the supplier. Written right there. Supplier. That's not my interpretation, Mary. That's his own word. I sat quietly. Supplier. George had been supplying people like raw material, like blanks for the scheme, finding suitable targets. Young, ambitious, in the construction industry, with some vulnerability in their biography, and bringing them to Proctor for a cut. I didn't know yet what exact cut, but that was a matter for the investigation, not me. The notebook, I said. Already on it, O'Connor replied. With this volume of material, I'll get the search warrant today. West End Avenue. I stood up, taking my coat. Mary, O'Connor said as I was heading to the door. Sullivan. He'll come to us on his own. I stopped, thinking for a second about that conversation in the office on Madison Avenue, about how George had looked up at me from below for the first time in all these years, about what he had uttered. I didn't think it would go this far. He'll come, I replied. He's a smart man. When a smart man realizes there is no way out, he looks for the best of the bad options. This is his option. I went out into the hallway. Victor was still sitting on the chair against the wall. As I drew parallel to him, he looked up. My mom won't find out, he asked quietly. I stopped. Helen Sterling, 63 years old, retired. The apartment on Willow Avenue that she rented to her son as an office for meeting clients, rejoicing at the extra money. A woman who knew nothing. That depends on the investigation, I said honestly, not on me, but the fact that you came in on your own, that is important. That is always taken into account. He nodded, looking back at the floor. I walked outside and called Allison. O'Connor is getting the search warrant today, I said. Proctor's phone is already with him. The correspondence. 9 names. George is in the contacts marked as the supplier. Victor gave a statement. Allison was silent for a second, the exact pause I recognized in a professional when assessing a situation. This is no longer just a complaint, she remarked. This is a case. Mary, congratulations. Too early, I replied. Not too early, Allison said firmly. With this material, they won't wiggle out, especially if the notebook is found. The notebook was found. O'Connor informed me of it at 5:30 p.m. with a short text. Search executed. Notebook seized. 18 pages of records. We're working. 18 pages. Names, amounts, dates. Everything Proctor had meticulously recorded by hand, old-fashioned and neat, entirely without thought that one day it would become evidence. He had been confident in his system, confident that the victims wouldn't talk, because they hadn't talked so far. Confident that plain, quiet Mary would come to him on Saturday with the money or get scared and back down. Neither happened. George called Allison at 7 p.m. that same day. Himself, just as I had said. Scheduled an appointment for Tuesday. Allison texted me a single word: in. I read the message sitting in my kitchen on Lexington Avenue. Titus settled down next to me on the table. Thank you for watching. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. We would love to know what you think.